Most of us have heard of diversity and inclusion, and we know that it's something that we should be striving toward. Studies show that diverse teams outperform non-diverse teams, in some cases increasing revenue by 19% and productivity by 35%. And it's generally agreed that an equitable world is a better one. But this can still be a fuzzy, abstract idea. So while we know that we want to be more inclusive, we don't always know how. Today, we're going to talk about how you can be more inclusive every day in the job that you're doing right now. As consultants in the business of dealing with our clients' problems, we are constantly proposing, delivering solutions. These solutions take the form of technology systems, product insights, business deliverables, and so much more. And we can be doing better. If we define success of a project for ourselves and for our clients as the solution actually being implemented and used effectively by the intended users, and we're still excluding some of those intended users, then we have a problem. We can fix that problem with inclusive practices. Before we jump in, I want to define what diversity and inclusion means in this context. When we talk about diversity, we often think of diversity of demographic, or kind of traditional diversity. This includes identities such as gender, race, and socioeconomic status. This is well within the realm of what we're talking about today, but it's not the only type of diversity that I want to bring attention to. The second is diversity of experience. These are things like different hometowns, different educations, different cohort levels, different thinking preferences, even different hobbies. All of these have the ability to shape the way that we view the world and solve problems just as much as our identities do. And finally, diversity of ability. The World Health Organization has defined disability as a mismatch between the attributes of a person's body and their environment. I was first introduced to this concept in a book by Kat Holmes entitled Mismatch. In the book, she describes 3 different types of mismatch: permanent, temporary, and situational. If we consider an app that really needs 2 hands to work well, then we can all think of times when we haven't had full access to both of our hands. It might be a permanent mismatch if someone has lost mobility in their hand due to an illness. It could be a temporary mismatch. So if you break your hand and you're in a cast, then you wouldn't be able to use your hand as you normally would. Or it could be situational. Maybe you're holding a cup of coffee or the hand of a toddler. In all of these cases, we are prevented from using the app as designed, and so we're excluded in some way for some period of time. Keep in mind these different types of diversity when we get into the how. I hope that this conversation goes on long past the remaining few minutes that I have with you. So in order to make this conversation and all of your follow-ups go as smoothly as possible, I want to talk through 3 principles for discussion and action within diversity and inclusion. This is also adapted from Holmes's book. The first is that inclusion is impolite. Polite here references polite conversation, as in, it doesn't quite pass the first date test. You know, don't talk about religion, politics, your ex, or diversity and inclusion. Things might get a little weird. Seriously, though, there is a fear here. We worry about damaging relationships with our coworkers because we unintentionally offended someone. We all have to enter into these discussions with the best intentions, assume the best intentions from others, and all have a little bit of grace in the process. The second is that inclusion is imperfect. So this really applies when we're talking about taking action toward inclusion. Things like creating policies or tools will likely have some gaps or missteps in them, and that's okay because we're still pulling towards inclusion. Finally, inclusion is ongoing. So what inclusion looks like today is different than it looked like yesterday, and I fully expect that it will look different tomorrow. We are constantly learning new things and applying that new knowledge to what we define inclusion as. And so while it won't be polite or perfect, it will be progress. So, the process for inclusive design in our day jobs. There's really 3 steps to incorporating inclusive design in your day job. The first is to recognize exclusion. This is the step where we identify gaps and mismatches. The second is to optimize inclusion. So this is where we fill the gaps and align the mismatches. There's also a critical step here where we identify who our intended users are and who they are not, and doing so, acknowledge the remaining gaps. And finally, we iterate for expansion. We apply new information and lessons learned from going through the first and second steps to live out principle number 3, that inclusion is ongoing. So to get into step 1, recognizing exclusion. Everything that we create follows this process, solution development process. So it begins with understanding what the problem is and what the requirements are for the solution. Then we get into the design of that solution. Next is the development and the delivery of that solution. And finally, there's a time for a retrospective where we reflect back and get feedback on what went well and what we can do better moving forward. So this can apply to every type of deliverable that we have, from a single user story all the way up to an entire project and across all sorts of different architectures. But if we look at it specifically in the context of the software development lifecycle, which many of us are familiar with, then requirements becomes gathering business requirements, and design becomes product design. The origins of diverse design are in these 2 areas. So it started with things like ADA compliance, and it has since shifted out to a much more holistic, inclusive design paradigm. There are lots of resources and tools for these 2 areas if you want to go deep, and I highly recommend it. There's a lot of great stuff there. Things like the book Mismatch and the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit. But what I want us to talk about today is to expand that thinking. That paradigm of diverse design and inclusive design can be applied to the development and the retrospective steps in this process. And we can even take it a step further. So, our solution development process is a critical step, but it is only one step in our much larger life cycle of a solution. So if we think about all of the steps that go into actually creating the final solution that is handed off to our client, it begins with recruiting, hiring, training, and supporting our solution creators. We look to our leaders and our corporate services for this. Next, we have to sell the solutions, and this falls to our management team. Then there's the initial discovery and scoping of the solutions, which is done by our program and our project managers, which gets us into our solution development process with the full team and the client. And then finally, there's the delivery and the implementation, and that also includes the full team and the client. So maybe you look at this and you find where you fit into this life cycle. So each role has a unique perspective and a unique responsibility to ensuring that our final solution is as inclusive as it can be. The most powerful tool that we have in order to recognize exclusion in all of these different steps is to ask ourselves questions about how we are prioritizing diversity and challenging our assumptions about our intended users. At the beginning stage, we can ask ourselves, are we recruiting and retaining diverse creators? Am I supporting inclusive practices with tools and resources? Our management team can ask themselves if they are engaging with diverse clients and diverse work. Our program and project managers get to see the big picture solution and ask, is this solution from a big scale inclusive? What assumptions are we making about our end users? And as they're looking at the project plan, they can ask themselves, have we accounted for time to answer these questions? And as they look at the makeup of the team, do we have the right people? Are we equipped to answer these questions? When we get into the solution development process, there's a lot of opportunity here. It's the largest team, and therefore the most diverse. And you're the closest to the individual pieces of the solution, the unique, distinct pieces that are the building blocks for the overall solution. So you get the opportunity to ask, is this specific solution inclusive? What assumptions am I making about this specific end user? What resources do I need to make a better design decision, a more inclusive design decision about this one specific thing that I'm working on? And finally, we get to the delivery and the implementation. This is where we get to see if the solution was a success for our clients and for our users. We can ask ourselves, what lessons did we learn? We can think about what we can do to make this project better immediately. And then also, what things should we take to our next project to make that one even better? So as you can see, we can and should apply inclusive practices at each step in this life cycle of a solution. And as you go through that, I encourage you to write down all of these questions and all of these answers. Document them in something like a decision log so that you're able to refer back to them and notice patterns, maybe even expose blind spots. There's an interesting story that illustrates the many opportunities for an inclusive design, and unfortunately one that did not foresee this case. So someone walked into a public library, and they saw a woman on one of the computers, and she was kind of struggling to maneuver things around, so the person walked up to her and offered help. And she said, yeah, actually, I'm applying for a job, and yes, I could use some help. And so the person sits down next to her, and they're working through the job application, and it prompts her to enter in her email address. And so the person's like, oh, no problem, we can set you up an email address. So they start going through that, and they get to the step where it prompts them to set up required multi-factor authentication via text message. So the person explains this to the woman, and she nods because she understands the concept, but then she says, but I don't have a cell phone. I don't have access to text message. I'm living in a shelter right now, and this job was supposed to be my way to move on. So whose responsibility was it to think of this use case? There's, the job application website, there's the email provider, there's all of these steps in the process, and really it could have just taken one person to ask and say, wait a second. We're assuming that our end user has access to something that's external to our system. What if they don't? Can we create a design for that person? Can we include that person? And what would that mean? Asking questions, understanding your assumptions, and constantly challenging to push for inclusion, that's part of your day job now. So once we have all of that documented, we know where our gaps are, we know where our mismatches are, it's time to optimize for inclusion. And we do that by filling the gaps and aligning the mismatches. In some cases, this is really easy. It might be a quick fix. Maybe we make multi-factor authentication optional rather than required. In other cases, it might be much more difficult. For those cases, I'll offer you these two methods to think about. And these are borrowed from the design world and can apply to any of our deliverables. The first is to design for one. So this is the concept where we acknowledge one of our users who has a known mismatch. Maybe it's a permanent mismatch. And so we design for that one user. And then we're able to recognize how it applies to lots of other users, maybe who have temporary or situational mismatches, or even just preferences. So the great example of this is voice commands. Originally designed for someone with a permanent mismatch, loss of sight, to interact with a visual interface. But we can also think of times when we have temporary mismatches, maybe recovering from an eye surgery, or situational mismatches. Maybe you're driving down the road and it's safer to use a voice command than to look down at your phone. Or it might even just be a preference. It's easier to talk to my phone than to, click through 3 different apps to find what the weather's going to be like today. So the second one is to offer choice. So when we think about our different types of users, this idea asks how much effort would it be to create 2 different scenarios for that end user. So the example here is maybe you have 2 sets of users, and the initial design was to go step by step by step with lots of information about going through this process. How much more effort would it be to design maybe an expedited way through that process, going more quickly through it? So this allows the user to choose, hey, I need more information, please, take me step by step, or no, I got it, I can go through this quickly. From a development standpoint of the solution, it's actually probably quicker to do the second one, where we're able to be expedited through the process, but we empower the user to choose that for themselves. So finally, in this step, we want to exclude with intention. So this is a crucial step because we have to acknowledge which gaps we won't fill and which users we won't include. Despite our very best efforts, we'll never be able to design every solution for every person. The most illustrative example of this is that there are 7,000 recorded languages in the world. By the time that it would take us to translate a single document into all of those languages, the document would be wildly out of date and have lost its value entirely. So it's really important to recognize which gaps we will fill and which ones we won't. This is okay too, because our true issue is that we're excluding our intended users on accident. Once we know who our intended users are, then it empowers us to make design decisions for those users. Document these somewhere also, because we want to call attention to the fact that this was an intentional decision. And we want to know that we can always go back to it, and we can always iterate and update our solution as we need to. Speaking of, the third step is to iterate for expansion. So we must go through this process of recognizing exclusion and optimizing for inclusion often. We want to do this on a macro scale, at the beginning of projects, at the end of projects, maybe even around big industry times, like a retail holiday season or open enrollment. Second, at the midpoints. Any major releases or milestones, we want to really check in at those points as well. For any project that's more than a year long, quarterly is a great cadence for this. And finally, on a micro scale, at every sprint planning and sprint retrospective, we want to be referencing back to all of that documentation that we created in steps 1 and 2 and updating it, applying any new information that we've gathered, and updating how we're going to go about our designs moving forward. We can also do this on a daily basis. Every time you take on a new task, a new deliverable, we can go through this exercise, this practice of recognizing exclusion and optimizing inclusion. So finally, I'll ask you this. If I were to ask you to remember a time that you felt excluded, intentionally, unintentionally, you can likely remember that feeling. And it's not a great feeling. If I were to ask you about a time that you felt included, you can likely remember that feeling too. And that one feels pretty good. We have the power to make that difference for our users, for our clients, for our coworkers. Each decision that you make towards diverse design makes the world a little more inclusive. And that's something that we can all celebrate. Thank you.